Hello, I'm David Rubenstein at the National Book Festival. Welcome to the National Book Festival, which this year is being done virtually. Our guest this year is Melinda Gates for our first part of our program. And I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress. And from another Washington, Seattle, Washington, is Melinda Gates. Thank you very much, Melinda, for doing this.
So glad we can do it, David.
So, Melinda, you have written your first book recently. It's a book about women. It's a book about empowering women. And I want to talk to you about that and what prompted you to write this book. So, how long did it take you to write this book, and what prompted you to write this book?
Yeah, I wrote it over most of a year. And what prompted me to write it was, I've been so incredibly fortunate with the foundation to travel to so many places in the world. And it's the people, and particularly the women, that I've met in these incredibly difficult circumstances, and seeing what they're doing to empower their families and their kids and the lengths they will go. Their stories ring in my head all the time, and it's what inspired me to finally write some of their stories down. Hopefully, maybe that their stories would inspire others too.
Now, your premise is that if women are empowered, they can change the world. And my question to you is, do you feel that's more the case in the developed world or the emerging markets, or both, but in different ways?
Both, absolutely both. And I know it to be true because I have seen it at the local grassroots level, whether you're in Southeast Asia or whether you're in a remote place in Africa. I see and I talk and I hear from the leaders how once the women got empowered, it changed so much in the family and the community and how they viewed things. The outcomes became better for their children over time. So we have the data now. But also in the US, I had to turn the question back on myself and say, how far are we in the United States? And start to realize, hey, we still have a ways to go in this country. And again, we know, again, from data that once women are empowered, they bring forward different issues. They push for different policies that help everybody. And so I realized this is something that needs to be done across the world. Many of the issues are actually the same, but you have to be on this journey step by step to get it done.
So in writing a book, it takes a lot more time than people probably think initially. So did this take a little more time than you thought? You obviously have other responsibilities. And in growing up in Dallas and then later in your life, were books very important to you?
Well, let me start with the latter question. Books have always been incredibly important to me because I believe it's the people that you meet, the places that you go, and the books that you read that inform your life. And so I've always been a really big reader, even in middle school and high school. I loved going to the library. I loved grabbing a big book and just enmeshing myself in it. So then when I went to write a book, I never thought I would be an author ever. And at first it took a while to even convince myself that I wanted to spend the time to do it or could do it. And then when I sat down to write it, parts of it absolutely just flowed. I had these stories for the years. And then parts were really hard because I felt I needed to be more revealing, and that, as my editor pushed me to say, if I was more vulnerable, people would relate to those pieces. And so those were obviously the toughest pieces to write. I do write about 3/4 of a page about an abusive relationship. I wrote and wrote and wrote and rewrote that page till I finally felt comfortable sharing that information.
So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the American ingenuity, which is the theme this year of the National Book Festival, and take you through some relatively ingenious decisions I think you made in your life, and then go back to some of the heart of the book. So in talking about some of the most ingenious decisions I would say that you made, one was you grew up in Dallas and had a chance to go to Notre Dame, which I think your family might have wanted you to go to, but you chose ultimately to go to my alma mater, Duke University. I would consider that to be an ingenious decision. But what prompted you to go to Duke when you had no family connection to Duke or nobody really pushing you to go there?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Catholic family, very Catholic community, all girls Catholic school for high school. So absolutely, the ultimate was kind of to go to Notre Dame. But I already knew about myself that I loved math, and I was lucky enough to have a computer science teacher in high school, which very few high schools had back then, and she had advocated to get about a dozen computers in the classroom, and I was already coding. So I knew that I wanted to code in college. I loved it, and that I wanted my career to be in that type of in technology. So when I went to Notre Dame, unfortunately, I was pretty set on going there if I got in, but unfortunately they were phasing their computer science department back into the departments. And I didn't think that was a good idea because I felt like I could kind of see where tech was going a bit. And so luckily, when I went to visit Duke, they had just gotten a big grant from IBM the year before, and they had 2 brand new computer labs, and they were all in about trying to create this computer science department. And I was able to say to myself, that is where I want to go, and that's for me.
So you had gone to an all-girls school, and then you went to Duke, which is co-ed. What was it like with men in the class? Are they yelling and screaming for the teacher's attention, and did they not treat the girls, as well as they did as you expected? How was that?
It was going to school at Duke was very different. I learned very quickly than my all-girls Catholic high school, where, a teacher would throw out a question and we would dutifully raise our hands and she would call on us. And then we'd have a group discussion. So just know that when I went to Duke, I had never, ever been to New York City. And I didn't have anybody in my high school from New York City, just as an example. So when I showed up for my political science classes in college early on, and, the teacher would throw out a question, I put my hand in the air. And all of a sudden, all the males who seemed to be from New York, all of a sudden just started shouting the answers out. And I thought, oh my gosh, what is this? And so I learned that I had to relearn how to get my voice into a conversation, because I absolutely knew when I read that book, whether it's economics or politics, I had something I wanted to say about it. So I had to learn to play the boys' game. Didn't love it, but I saw how the game was played and I learned to play it.
So Duke had a program then where in 5 years you get an undergraduate degree and an MBA as well, and you were in that program. And then when you decided to leave Duke with your degree, you had a choice between IBM, which is a very well-known company, and a little company in the Seattle area called Microsoft. Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to go to Microsoft and not IBM, where you had an offer?
Yeah, so I had worked for IBM for several summers and had a fabulous summer job. And I thought I was going to go there, but I told IBM, I am going to look at other places the last year of my MBA. And I turned down all the other places in my interviewing process, but I still had to go meet my hiring manager on my spring break in April at IBM Dallas, where I thought I was going to work. And I had one interview left at this little company, Microsoft, up in Seattle, about 1,600-ish employees then. And when I went to meet with my hiring manager, who happened to be a female at IBM, I said, I've turned all these other job offers down, but I still have one more place I want to go. And she said, because she was asking me, was I ready to accept the offer? And she said, would you mind asking who the company is you're going to see right after this tomorrow? And I said, well, I'm flying to Seattle. I'm seeing this little company, Microsoft. Maybe you've heard of them. And she said, oh, yes, I've heard of them. Would you like a piece of advice? And I said, sure. She said, if you get an offer, take it. And she floored me. This is my hiring manager. And I said, why? And she said, because, look, I think you would have a great career at IBM. You know this place. She said, but you will have to take time to move through every rung of management and prove yourself. And you can, I think. But she said, at a company like that is advancing as fast as they are, your chance for advancement as a woman, she said, I think would be meteoric. And I went and interviewed. I ended up loving it. It was a crazy interview schedule. Some of the people on it seemed odd to me, but I loved what Microsoft was doing. They knew they were creating the future. And I just said to myself, I want to be part of that.
So you took the offer from Microsoft, and when you went there, was it as good as you thought, or did you actually think maybe this wasn't the place for you and you actually thought of leaving at one point?
Yeah, I absolutely loved the innovation. I loved what we were creating. I believed in it. I knew we were changing the world. I loved the charisma and the passion of the people around me. What I didn't like less than a couple of years in, was just the kind of constant boys debate club and the rough and tumble. And again, just like at Duke, I could see the game. I could see how it was played. I had the backbone to play it, but I got tired of it. And so I thought, maybe I'll just leave. I had other job offers. I could still talking to a few companies, but I thought before I go, I'll try and do something, which is just try to be myself. And I thought, I know I'm going to fall on my face. I know I'm going to fail, but that's okay. I gave it my all, and then I'll go to some other company. And I was willing to leave Seattle. But I have to say, I started being myself, and I was happier. I was happier with who I was, even outside of work, because I was feeling like I was becoming not only brash inside of work under the current culture, but brash outside, and I didn't like myself. I started liking myself more, and lo and behold, as I was moving up in management, I was able to attract these amazing, mostly male developers from around the company. And people would say, how did you get so-and-so to work on your project? And I said, I'm not sure, but I think it's a little bit the culture I've created on my management teams. And sure enough, being myself ultimately ended up working. And I had a fabulous 9-year career there that I would not give up for anything. I learned so much, and it was pretty amazing.
But during that career, you also met a young man who was the founder of that company, Bill Gates. When did you actually meet him? Was it the first day you went to Microsoft, or was it later on?
No, it was in the first few months that I met Bill at the company. Yeah.
And that was love at first sight?
I wouldn't say that. He asked me out. Well, first of all, he asked me out in the parking lot at Microsoft on a Saturday, because we all tended to work on Saturdays from about 9 a.m. to about 3 or 4 p.m. It was a small company, 4 buildings. His building was next to mine. We happened to park in the same little parking lot. So I'm walking out of my building, and he's walking out of his, and he struck up a conversation. And he asked me out for 2 weeks from Friday night. At the end of this conversation, I'm like, 2 weeks from Friday night? I'm 23. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm pretty spontaneous. I kind of teased him. I said, call me up closer to the date. He took my phone number. But then he called me about an hour later at my little apartment, and he said, well, is this spontaneous enough? I could go out tonight, except I have a user group meeting and some other corporate dinner, and then maybe we could meet for a drink. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I can take that for being that was spontaneous. And I just thought, oh, he'll be interesting to meet. I'll go on one date and that'll be it. But I ended up finding that he was far more interesting than I thought. And obviously one thing led to another. And here we are today, married 26 years. 26
years. So you have 3 children. And when your children were coming along, you said to Bill Gates, I think I love working at Microsoft, but maybe I should stay home with the children. Was he surprised about that?
Not surprised, shocked, shocked. And one thing Bill has always said about me is once I've made up my mind, I've made it up. And I had already decided I was going to leave the company, and then basically told him while I was pregnant. And he was shocked for a couple of reasons. One is he knew how much I loved working. He also knew how much we connected, both in our personal life, but over the work. We enjoyed Microsoft, and I knew his job well because of the work that we did at the company. I understood what things were incredibly hard versus more, easier to do. But when I explained it to him in my thinking, I just said, look, you're this hard-charging CEO, in a hard industry. You love it. You're not going to give up your work. I know that. I'm not asking you to give up your work. But we both agree on the values already that we want from both of our families instilled in our kids. And I just said, I just don't see that happening with 2 hard-charging executives. Somebody needs to be home, at least for a while, with the kids. So yes, I shocked him.
Well, so it worked out. Your kids are in pretty good shape. I think you have one still at home, or?
Yes, we have a 17-year-old who's home in high school, and we have our son who came back from college early because of COVID. So he's also now home unexpectedly for the summer as well.
Okay. So one of the very ingenious things that the 2 of you did is you created a foundation, and that foundation is focused principally on 2 areas. Is it K-12 education in the United States and healthcare in emerging markets and the least developed areas in the world? Why did you pick those 2 areas and say everything else is not something we're going to focus on?
Well, we learned early on from our friend Warren Buffett that once you define your bullseye, what happens is you can let other things fall away and you can get really good at the things inside of your bullseye. And Warren was a very good friend. And Bill and I started to really look at, from our travels and from our own experience in the United States, what were the pieces that felt like if you could help move an area forward would really bring forward more equality for people. And the two issues were, we felt like if you can't grow up with basically good health, you can't go on to get an education and then the job you want to have in society. So we felt there were many places in the emerging markets where the basic health just wasn't there. People were dying of diseases that people in Europe and the US weren't dying of. So we decided to focus on health. That seemed like the biggest inequity in the developing world. And in the US, we both felt we had been incredibly lucky to have great education. And yet so many kids in the United States, in the US public school system, weren't getting a great education. We felt like if we could do something about that, those kids could go on to have whatever job they wanted and live their full potential in life. So that was how we picked our two big areas.
So another area of ingenuity, you might say, is that Warren Buffett, you said is a very good friend, called you up one day and said, you know what, I'm going to give the bulk of my money to your foundation. Was that a shock to you? And what did he ask in return? Did he ask for anything?
That was a huge shock to both Bill and me. You know, Warren had always planned to give his money away through the Susan T. Buffett Foundation, what his wife, Susie, who we also knew and who we adored, through that philanthropic institution. So after she unexpectedly passed away and Warren had had some time, then he came and said that this was what he intended to do instead. And Bill and I were completely in shock. I would say both of us were in tears. We took a long walk, talked about it, and started to say, oh my gosh, what could you do with the world if with that level of resource? Warren asked nothing of us. In fact, he was so clear about what he wanted to do. He was not thinking at the time of being a trustee, even at the foundation. And we said to him, look, we really think that would be a good idea. Both Bill and I thought about it for quite a bit. And it took us a while. We had several conversations with Warren. And then he said, no, I think you're right. And Bill could not be more glad Warren is a trustee. He adds to our thinking. He's wise. He's very hands-off, but we have benefited from some of his thinking. But he asked nothing of us. That is unbelievable.
One other question before I talk about the book about American ingenuity is the ingenious way that the three of you, Warren, Bill, and you, came up with the idea for the Giving Pledge. Whose idea was that? All three, I assume. And what is its purpose and how has it worked?
That was Warren's idea. Let's be really clear. Warren had this idea and he didn't know exactly what he wanted to do, but he was formulating this idea in his head of, look, this is right for society, is that wealth is passed back. If you are lucky enough to live in a place like the United States, you have benefited from that, and the wealth should mostly go back to society. And so Warren had this idea and brought it to us, and we all started talking about it. And then there were a series of small dinners with other people who were either doing philanthropic work already, or we knew were thinking about it, and who had means. And we started to work together to formulate this idea. And then between the three of us, we decided to form the Giving Pledge. And I can't believe it, 10 years on, none of the three of us could have imagined 10 years on we'd have, 210 members of the Giving Pledge in 23 different countries. Wow. That wasn't even in our wildest dream when we started it.
So let's go back to the book for a moment. As part of your responsibilities for the foundation, you traveled to emerging markets. Lots of them are in Africa, Southeast Asia, other places like that. And when you would go there, you were, I guess, horrified, shocked to see the way women were treated, specifically genital mutilation, spousal abuse, lack of education, lack of income, and so forth. What was your impression when you first went there? Were you horrified? You couldn't believe how bad it was? And what did you do to resolve to do something about that?
Well, when we first started traveling to emerging markets, what we really saw was just the inequity. I mean, it was just so obvious when you saw people walking down the road. So there might be, say, an open air market or a town they were going to, and I just couldn't believe as we would be driving by in a, some sort of nice vehicle or that you would see men so often with flip-flops on their feet and maybe smoking some cigarettes and taking a little bit of stuff to market. But then you'd see a woman who was barefoot, baby on the back, sometimes in her belly, and she'd have a huge thing she might be carrying on her head. And so it was just so visible that there was such an inequity between men and women. And so it sort of started billing me on a series of learning questions. Well, why is society this way? Why are the markets not this way? What has philanthropy tried to do or not do? Why have these countries fallen behind in certain infrastructure? And why is there this great disparity between men and women? And so that led us to more and more and more questions. And then I started to see some of the things like female genital cutting, which I just I have to be honest, I didn't even know it existed. And so then we started to figure out, okay, what would we do around some of these issues?
Linda, there's a story in your book about how when you've met with some young women, they have often said to you, and one in particular, here's my baby, can you take my baby home with you? That must be very heart-rending when that happens. When did that actually happen first to you?
That first happened to me in India a number of years ago, and it's heartbreaking is what it is. And you start to realize that, a mother would have to be in incredibly dire circumstances to ask you to take their child home. And she didn't know me from any stranger. I mean, she had no idea. She just knew I was a Western woman there in a pair of khaki pants and a white shirt from the US. It's heartbreaking. And what I talk about, though, in the book is we have to open our hearts to those moments of heartbreak and not push them away, but let them in. Let our heart break and say, what if that was me? What if I was that woman? What length would I go? And that's when you start to answer the questions about, okay, what is it we should be doing for these women so they can begin to lift themselves up and lift their families and their kids up? So those moments of heartbreak have been hard to take in, but I think they're also important.
You also found throughout your travels that the problems were that women were not really being educated, and therefore they very often couldn't help support their family with a job or so forth. And that very often, even though they were working much less than their capacity would let them do if they were given education. So what have you tried to do to help educate women in these areas?
Yes, we know that education is fundamental in any society, and it helps open up so many opportunities. Just to give you one example in the developing world, the way a woman advocates for herself or her children in the health system changes drastically if she has an education. And so that alone, in terms of benefiting her children's health, is worth looking at. So what we have tried to do over time with many, many, many partners in the developing world is make sure that people have appropriate information about their own health and their bodies and their children's health. Even beginning with that form of education allows them to access the health system and health services in a way that will benefit the family. Then, of course, it goes on long beyond that. You need to make sure that girls and boys are in school and stay in school at the same level. And there are a lot of societal issues about why that doesn't happen today.
So some people say, well, you're helping people in Africa or India, but what about helping people in the United States? Why are you focused, some people would say, on things outside the United States? Why don't you focus more in the United States? How do you respond to those people who say that?
Yes, so we do both. We absolutely try to help in the developing or emerging markets and in the United States. But what we say to people is, look, we believe as a couple, all lives, no matter where they're lived, have equal value. And yet the world doesn't treat all lives as if they have equal value. And so If we can help these emerging markets, people really get on that path to self-sustainability, they'll lift themselves up. They'll lift their communities and their economies up. We've seen it in South Korea with the appropriate type of aid. You get the system up and running, and then people take it up themselves. And we think that's worth doing because we believe that somebody's life, whether they're living in Senegal, is the same as whether they're living in Seattle. They just don't have the same opportunity.
Now, one of the things you talk about in the book is the fact that you are a committed Catholic, yet you've decided that one of the things you can most do to help people, women in the emerging markets, is to give them or help get them birth control. Was that a difficult thing for you, and have you struggled with that, and how has that birth control effort been going in these markets?
Yes, that was an incredibly difficult decision for me to make, not to do the work, but to speak publicly about the work and to go much further as a foundation in terms of birth control. And what I came to see, though, throughout all my travels and everything I learned and studied is that when a woman has access over contraceptives, she will make different choices about spacing the births of her children. And when she can space the births of her children, she has a chance of getting out of poverty. And that benefits her children and her family. There is literally no low-income country in the world that hasn't gone through this transition of once they allow and provide access to contraceptives and let women make a choice, they can move. The economy literally moves the country from low to middle income and eventually middle to high income. You have to make that transition. And so as a Catholic, it was very hard for me to speak out. I grew up in the Catholic Church. I am still Catholic, but I also went to a high school that believed in social justice. And what I knew to be right and true after all of my travels and speaking with so many women was that this was a tool that we use in the United States. American men and women who are Catholic tell you at over a 90% rate they use birth control and believe in it. And we needed to speak out and do something about that. And so ultimately, I decided took a lot of courage and vulnerability, but to speak out on behalf of women around the world. And I'm glad I did.
So you've obviously influenced a lot of women around the world. You've helped a lot of women. There are two young women who you obviously are a mother to. Are they say to you, Mom, we're proud of what you're doing to help other women, or Mom, could you spend more time with us? How do you balance those two, and what do your two daughters think about what you're doing to empower women?
Yes, so these have been for a long time very active and live conversations in our home with our two daughters, for me, and our son, Rory, who's in between them and who's 21. And sure, when the kids were young, there was this tricky balance between how much I worked and how much I stayed home and was with them. I didn't always get that right, and we have very open and honest conversations about that now that they're older. Sometimes I got it right. Other times it was hard for them if I was traveling. But I constantly worked at it and tried to listen to them. Now what all three of my children say to me is, they're all young adults now, we are so proud of the work you do in the world. And each of them says, hey, Mom, if we are lucky enough to find the right partner in life and have a family, we also want to work too, because we believe in giving back to society. And we see that it's a balance, and we hope to be able to do that as well.
Linda, I want to thank you very much for being with us at the National Book Festival and talking about your book, The Power of Lift, How Women Can Be Empowered to Change the World. And I want to thank you very much for this conversation. And I appreciate everything you've done with the Giving Pledge and with all the other things you're doing in your philanthropy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me.